I'd now like to introduce Ian, who is the MD of Greencore Construction, who are, award winners. It's almost like an award ceremony with Ian. You've obviously won the Energy Pathfinders Award recently, as well as other Planet Living National Leader Awards. So it will be very, very interesting to hear from you about some of the local and practical projects that are happening. Over to you, Ian.
Thank you, John, and good morning, everybody. Just trying to make sure the slides move. Here we go. Right. I think one of the things that sums up the state we're in at the moment is this great quote from David Attenborough: what we do in the next 10 years will profoundly impact the next few thousand. So we see the next 10 years, the next decade, as really important. And our mission at Greencore is to scale up the delivery of low and zero carbon homes until they can no longer be ignored by the mainstream house builders. As a small company, we know we're not going to change everything on our own. We're not going to be able to build all zero carbon houses, but we feel that we can act as a catalyst for change with other people. And that's really what we're trying to do. Right, having problems with the shifting. Here we go. Setting the context of what's happening from a political and environmental point of view. I'm really excited about being in Oxfordshire because I think it's one of the places to be working at the moment. So all of the councils in Oxfordshire have declared a climate emergency, and we've got this great initiative with Bioregional of One Planet Oxfordshire to make Oxfordshire the first One Planet county in the world. And there's also this really good initiative with Oxford Friends of the Earth, the Oxfordshire Zero Carbon Homes Initiative. So there's a lot happening within Oxfordshire, but within the UK, we know we've got high-level legislation such as the Climate Change Act. There's the 6th Carbon Budget. We've got the Green Recovery Plan as a way of recovering from COVID, and a relatively recent target of 78% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2035. So really, everything is set for this decade of change. But the thing that worries me, the elephant in the room, is embodied carbon. Everybody's talking about zero carbon, but do they really know what zero carbon means? When we build a new house, all of the materials and their manufacture, processing, transport and delivery and construction on site are all responsible for CO2 emissions. And a typical house is responsible for something like 50 to 60 tons of CO2 emissions. And that's what's known as its embodied carbon, or its upfront carbon, or its carbon footprint. And then if we've done a reasonable job of building that house, it's going to emit another 5 tons of CO2 per year in use. So that means that houses we build this year will be responsible for 200 tons of CO2 by 2050. We know we've got a problem with CO2, and yet we are still contributing to the problem. And it seems to me that we've got to stop contributing to that problem as quickly as possible. And addressing both the embodied carbon and the operational carbon is really important, because when most people are talking about zero carbon, what they really mean is the operational emissions. And we've got to tackle both of these things. Fortunately, bio-based materials are one of the tools that we can use to deliver zero carbon buildings and low carbon buildings, because they capture CO2 during their growth and they lock it up as cellulose through the process of photosynthesis. And if we work our way through the chemistry and the maths of photosynthesis, there's this great multiplication factor. It actually takes 1.8 kilograms of CO2 to make a kilo of cellulose. So every kilo of cellulose we lock up in a building is actually locking it up more than 1 kilo of CO2. So that's really important. So it's pretty straightforward, really. The more bio-based materials we incorporate in buildings, the more carbon we lock up. So replacing high energy materials such as steel and concrete with bio-based materials such as timber locks up carbon and reduces the carbon footprint. So when we come to design a building, all of the choices we make in the design and the construction determine not just what the building looks like, but how it performs thermally and what its carbon footprint is. And if you make the right choices, you can build houses that have zero carbon footprints and zero emissions. And that's what we try to do. So we've been doing this for a few years now and scaling up from single houses to small groups of houses, and then to larger groups of houses. And this is the project we're working on at the moment at Springfield Meadows. It's 25 houses, 9 of which are affordable, 16 open market. It's fairly recently been featured on a great video by Fully Charged with Robert Llewellyn. And that's because it's got not just the houses being zero carbon, but it's also got PV panels and an electric car club. And as Robert Llewellyn says, isn't this what housing developers should be building? We think it is. So what's special about Springfield Meadows? We set out with a target to have zero carbon footprint in the buildings. We use the passive house methodology to deliver passive house thermal performance. So that's following the principles and hitting the targets, but they're not certified as passive houses. But what it does mean is that you've got minimal heating requirements, but passive house is not just about energy, it's about comfort and health as well. These should be really comfortable, healthy houses to live in. And we've assessed the energy use from these houses through regulated and unregulated energy use and made sure that there are sufficient PV panels on the roof to generate that energy so that they're net zero energy in use, albeit they will be importing from the grid in the winter and exporting in the summer. They're net zero across the year. So that means the houses will have low energy bills as well. We've got an electric car club and also a car sharing scheme, a partnership with the Berks, Bucks and Oxen Wildlife Trust, which we think is the first time they've partnered with a contractor or a developer. And all of this is within the framework of One Planet Living. As builders, we're all a little bit scientifically focused and data focused, so we tend to be better at focusing on things like energy and carbon. But we find the One Planet Living framework is really good to give us a holistic view of health and well-being, nature, biodiversity, waste, energy, transport, and all of those other things. And this project has been awarded global leadership status. So the formula that we use, that we sometimes refer to as the secret formula, but we always share it, is relatively simple. We use bio-based materials to lock up carbon, the principles of the passive house standard to reduce energy use. So that's high levels of insulation, designing out thermal bridging, excellent levels of air tightness, triple glazed timber windows, heat recovery ventilation, and then this is an all electric scheme. So electric heating, hot water and cooking, and then using PVs to generate electricity and batteries to store it. All of these are well-known technologies that if you put them together will deliver zero carbon buildings. And our target is to do at least 500 homes in Oxfordshire over the next 5 years. And we want to go beyond where we've been so far into what we describe as climate positive housing. We came to the conclusion a couple of years ago that it was no longer good enough to say, how do we minimize the negative impact on the environment? We wanted to ask a different question, which is, how do we create a positive impact on the environment every time we build a house? So we want to lock up more carbon at the construction stage than is emitted. We want to generate more energy than the houses use. We want to massively increase wildlife and biodiversity. And if we can build enough of these houses, I think they'll act as a catalyst for local food production, green transport, and that sort of thing. And working with local community energy schemes to make neighbouring villages zero energy. So not just the houses that we build to be net zero energy, but I think it's possible to make neighbouring villages net zero energy. And we also want to create a green business park in Oxfordshire, because Oxfordshire is a hotbed of innovation and green technology, and we want a place for all of those businesses to cross-fertilize with each other, to attract other like-minded businesses into the area, and then the ripples of that to go out into the rest of the UK as well to help with the sustainable agenda. So that's what we're trying to do. Unfortunately, I can't stay for the panel session, so I think I've been given permission to answer any questions that come now, and I'll hand back to John.
Thank you very much indeed, Ian. Yes, Ian has to disappear, but you have had one question in from Jacques van der Westhuizen. Ian, how did these houses perform in terms of overheating, and how was this accessed and mitigated? That's from Jacques.
Right. So the first thing is we do an overheating assessment at the design stage. One of the challenges we've had here is that the 16 private houses, 12 of them have been sold and built on a custom build basis. So they are subject to customization by private individuals who always seem to want to put more glass in. So there's a bit of a balance and a constant challenge of trying to rein people back on too much glass. But we do simple things like making sure that you can have the ability to purge heat by opening things like skylights at top of stairs and windows at ground floor level, the overheating modelling, and the ability to provide shading to south facing and west facing windows and those sorts of things. But I think it's one of those challenges that we've got to keep monitoring how these houses perform and constantly feeding that back in to make sure we get better and better over time.
Thank you very much indeed. And you have had, you're very popular. You've had another question. Why not certified passive house? Is that about the admin? Is that about sort of the nature of the nomenclature?
It's a very good question. So the passive house system is very, very good. But like all of these things, I think you get 80% of the benefit for doing 20% of the work. And so that's where we focus our efforts on trying to get the maximum impact for the minimum amount of work, but also the building system that we use, which is our own panelized system called Beyond, has hemp and lime as an insulation within it, which has a natural phase change property. And that means the real performance of these houses is about twice as good as the output from the PHPP model. So rather than slavishly trying to follow a model and get below this threshold of 15 kilowatt hours per square meter on paper, we know that if we're a little bit above that level, the reality is the houses will deliver to that level. And then it's a question of balancing that with PVs on the roof. So we think the money is better spent in putting an extra few kilowatts of PV generation on the roof than it is trying to chase through a certificate to go on the wall. But I suspect other people might have different views.
Thank you very much indeed. Another question from Simon Beaumont. Are you undertaking any monitoring of the houses to see if they are performing as designed and meeting the net zero design assumption?
We are, and we will be doing a lot more as we go forward as well.
Wonderful. Question from David Evans. What's the anticipated design life of the external elements or cladding to your houses?
So the design life of the houses is centuries. The cladding, we're using a variety of different cladding materials, mainly render and timber. And the timbers that we're using are ones that are modified in some way. So one is Kebony, which is Norwegian pine that's modified with the waste product from the sugar beet industry. And that gives it a life of 50 years or so. And the other one we're using is poplar that's thermally modified. It's known as brimstone poplar, and that has a similar life as well. But we're also using some more traditional materials like larch, which might have slightly shorter lives. So we're mixing it up a bit with the claddings.
Thank you, Ian. One last question, if you've got time. What was the strategy for the foundations on this project? Several sustainable projects we have been involved with have opted for screw piles to limit the amount of concrete involved.
Right. We've used insulated rafts on all of these for exactly the same reason. So we find a raft is a really good way of eliminating thermal bridging at the plinth. It minimises the concrete, and we also use low cement concrete in those rafts as well.
Thank you very much indeed, Ian. I know you have to disappear, but thanks ever so much for enlightening us in such a positive fashion.